guys, so this is going to be the tutorial for the one hand on hip front pose. So for every single pose we're going to do, we're going to work from the ground up. The reason why we're doing that is because posing, whether it's men's physique or even bodybuilding, we want to be working from the ground up, because ultimately the position you put your feet and your legs in is going to ultimately dictate how you look in the rest of the pose. So what we're going to do initially with Ryan is we're going to get him to hit the front pose just standing completely front on, and we'll see what it looks like. So Ryan, if you just want to hit it completely front on. So you can see there, whilst obviously he has a really nice shape, he's not quite maximizing how good he can look. So you can see the full width of his midsection is being exposed to the camera or the judges. And then is not fully displaying sort of the fullness and width of his shoulders. So this is why we're going to get him in a bit more of a twisted position. Ryan, if you want to firstly take a step with that right foot and just twist it so it's horizontal. And then that left foot, if we can move it a little bit further out and then get it on the toe. Yep, brilliant. So a really important thing to consider with the front pose is the angle in which the pivot leg is facing in. So essentially you want it either completely towards the camera or the judge, or slightly inwards from that position. So what will happen when you point it too far out, so Ryan, if you point it fairly far out and you just hit a pose, so you can see here, when he does this and brings this out, it will ultimately bring his waist to a more square on position. So what it's going to create is a similar effect of hitting the pose completely front on, where your waist looks bigger and your arms and delts look a bit smaller. So this is what we want to avoid. Similarly, if we do the absolute opposite, so really tilt that inwards. So you can see here, whilst yes, it makes his waist look a lot smaller, ultimately he's turning this into a side pose, which is, one, it's going to be called out by the judges because it's not a front pose, it's a side pose, and it's actually taken away from his width up top. So the actual distance between the delt to the delt is going to be a lot smaller, and it's going to make him look a lot less wide up top. So this is something we want to avoid. So what we want to do is just have this either straight or slightly inwards. So you can see here, you have a good combination of a really nice V-taper in the waist and really wide shoulders as well. So that's the footwork. So as you can see here, this sort of horizontal, what I like to call standing leg, is going to allow him to have his waist in a bit more of a twisted position, where the initial position of the waist is going to be facing more to the side or a little bit more diagonally. And then this is what I call the pivot leg. So this is where basically you're going to be moving from pose to pose, so you should have absolutely no weight on that leg whatsoever. So Ryan, if you want to just make sure you're distributing all your weight onto that right leg, so you can see there his torso will slightly shift to the side a little bit, and this is what we want. So I like to call this like sitting into the hip. And then this ultimately is going to, one, make your waist look a lot smaller, and two, it's going to give you a lot more of a foundation to be able to sort of engage your abs when you are in the pose. So as you can see there, what we want to make sure we're doing is aligning our torso properly. So Ryan, if you like slightly lean forward that way with your torso, I want an example of what we don't want to do. So a lot of people, when they're doing this sort of sitting into the hip, is they'll lean with the torso as well, which just completely throws off the symmetry of the pose. Another thing which people do, so Ryan, if you lean back a little bit, like over lean back, is they'll do this. So in an effect to sort of counteract that, they're going to lean back, and it's going to look really, really awkward. So what we want to make sure is our body is upright. So what we want to make sure we're doing is we want this part of the torso to be completely upright, and we want the delts, so from left to right, if we drew a straight horizontal line, the delts will line up. So that's absolutely perfect there. Okay, so from here, Ryan, if you just want to put your arms by your side, so when we're starting, we're just going to want to keep our arms by our side. So initially, you'll find with every single pose in men's physique, you want some degree of flaring your lats. So Ryan, if you just from that position, flare your lats. So you can see immediately how his V-taper comes in a lot more here, and just the width of his delts is a lot more pronounced as soon as you flare out your lats. So with the one hand on hip front pose, what I want you to do with this left hand is put that on your hip. So you always want the hand where you've got the pivot leg to be the hand on the hip. So as you can see there, he's got his hand on the hip. So at the minute, Ryan's got it in a fist. You can sort of alternate between having either a fist or a hand on the hip, depending on what works well with your physique. So for now, with Ryan, we're just gonna do a fist on the hip, so you can see sort of the height he's got it there. And then from there, we're gonna play around with Ryan, bringing his elbow forward and back with the lat. So you wanna flare this lat out to bring this elbow forward. So you can see there. So you can see, if Ryan completely relaxes it, so relax that lat, you can just see the fullness in his arm and delt isn't quite as pronounced, just because it isn't as close to the camera or the judges. But the minute he starts to flare that forward, there's a lot more fullness there. But what you don't want to do is over flare it to the point where this chest caves in and you just lose the fullness in the arm and the delt. So you want a bit of a compromise. So that's a pretty good position for Ryan there. So that's that arm sorted. So now we want to think about what we're doing with the other arm. So obviously we're still flaring the lat. So Ryan, if you just stick that out quite far there. So this is what you see a lot of people doing, is they'll stick their arm out really far and they think it will create more width in the pose. But what they're doing is you'll actually so if you start there and you see as you go there, you actually flatten this delt off as you do that, which obviously is counteractive to what you want to do. And then you also create a lot of empty space here, which is obviously not what you want to do. You want to look more compact and you want to look more filled in the pose. So what we want to do is flare this lat so the upper arm comes in, and then you want a little bit of elbow flexion so the arm will come in a little bit there. And that will create a really nice delt cap and a really nice fullness in the tricep here. So that's a really nice look there. So that's what you're doing with the arm. And then from there, we just want to focus on what we're doing with our abs. So obviously we want to show condition in our abs. So what I would always do in a twisted front pose is focus on the main abs and then the obliques on the side in which you're showing. So if you squeeze them, yeah, wicked. So ultimately, you're not really showing these obliques here, so I wouldn't focus too much on squeezing them too much, because ultimately, if you squeeze them, just squeeze them, what you're gonna do is like kind of thicken your waist a little bit here, because ultimately when you do contract your obliques, you make your waist a little bit wider. So I would just focus on this main abs and these main obliques as well. Another thing we need to watch out for is hunching over when contracting your abs. So Ryan, if you just hunch over a bit, so this is what a lot of people do, is they'll end up rounding the spine to get on their abs, and ultimately you'll see it'll thicken the waist and it's going to make their shoulders look a lot less wide. So what we need to do is make sure we're more upright. So just think of having your spine in a more upright position, and then sitting into the hip is going to give you a stable foundation to then just be able to properly contract your abs. So this is absolutely perfect from Ryan. So now we've got Ryan set up in the pose, there are just a few little notes and a few little things we want to look out for. So a lot of people get focused on contracting and squeezing everything, and this is actually something we want to get away from doing. So obviously we want to be on our abs and we want to be contracting our abs, but other than that, we want to be focusing on displaying shape and width rather than squeezing everything like we're a bodybuilder. So one thing we want to avoid is contracting our pecs. So if you squeeze your pec really hard like that, you see how in order to do that, he's bringing his arm in and he's taking away from the width of his physique. So that's something we want to avoid. So if you go back to where you were, and another thing we want to avoid from doing is squeezing our arms too hard. So if you really contract your biceps, yeah, so you see that a lot of people will squeeze the biceps too hard. Once again, it's going to take away from the pop in the delts, and even the fullness in the arms can be taken out. And you have to think about when you're in a mandatory pose, in comparison to other people, you're going to be on stage for a substantial period of time, and if you're squeezing every single body part as hard as you can, eventually you're going to start shaking and you're going to start sweating and it'll look really, really bad on stage. Another factor to weigh into consideration is to whether we want to have a fist on the hip or a hand on the hip. So this is going to be very person dependent, and it's ultimately like what's going to be able to allow you to really flare this lat as much as possible and really pop that lat into that delt. So at the minute, Ryan's doing a fist on the hip. But if we want to try a hand on the hip, so Ryan, if we put the hand on the hip there, so as you can see, say if you've got shorts or board shorts on, what you want is your hand at basically the top of the shorts. So if you have them too high, so put them a bit higher. So put your hand a bit higher, like a lot higher. Yeah, so you'll find it hard to flare your lats, and it will actually take away from the fullness in your arm and delt. And then put them really low. Once again, it's going to be really awkward and really hard to flare your lats. So this is for most people, which is comfortable for them. So what I would do is from that position, start shifting your hand inwards towards the middle, and then see what is the position which enables you to create the most fullness. So what I would do is just film yourself hitting different variations of the front pose. And then the main things you're looking out for is the fullness and sweep in the tricep, and then the fullness and cap in this delt. So Ryan, if you just bring that back a bit, bring it about there, yeah, spot on, and do it there. So you can see here, we're creating a really nice sort of sweep in the tricep here, and really nice fullness in the delt. One thing you want to avoid as well is, as we mentioned before, we want to avoid this chest caving in. So if you really bring that in, you can see that chest is starting to contract, that chest, and it starts to cave in. So we want to make sure this looks as full as possible here. So if we just bring it back a bit, there we go, spot on. So that was the one hand on hip front pose. Next up is going to be the hands off hip front pose. So some federations, such as Two Bros and PCA, they'll allow you to actually hit a front pose with your hands off your hip. For some people, this works really, really well, and it looks really good in the pose, and especially the taller men's physique athletes, I find it works really well with. So what we're going to do now is just drop your hands, take them off your hips, just relax. What we want to do, literally without moving our arms anywhere, without sticking our arms out, all you want to do is just flare your lats. So you can see immediately here how it creates more fullness in your arms and delts. And from that position, you don't really need to do that much really. All you need to do is sort of have a little bit of elbow flexion here inwards, and similar here as well, a little bit of elbow flexion inwards. So you can see here, it looks more like a pose, and it creates a little bit more sort of sweep in the tricep and the delt. Really aesthetic here. So what we want to avoid is just stick your arms out massively and then do that. So this is what a lot of people do. They think it's like a bodybuilding front relax pose, and they end up sticking their arms out massively. What we want to do is just bring them in there. And as you can see, looks way more aesthetic and way more like a men's physique pose. As I said, just play around with doing it yourself, see if it suits your physique, and then if it does, then choose to do it. So that was the hands off hip front pose. Next up is going to be the two hands on hip front pose. So the final variation of the front pose we're going to talk about is the two hand on hip front pose. So similar, Two Bros and PCA and some other federations will allow you to hit this pose, and for some people it will work really, really well. So all we want to do is exactly the same with the left side, repeat what we're doing, and then with the right side, all you need to do, put your hand on the hip in the same position and just flare your lat forward there. So what we want to do is create enough sort of fullness here, so we want to flare on it enough here so we can actually see sort of the sweep of that tricep and the sweep of the delt. So if you don't flare it enough, this will happen and you can't really see it, and it will really take away from your width in the pose. If you over flare, so over flare there, you can see his chest caves in massively and it just looks really, really awkward. So we want to have a decent compromise of that. So as you can see here, Ryan looks really, really nice in pretty much every single pose. But what I would do for yourself is, once again, play around with every single pose and see if it suits your physique. That was the front pose tutorial, and stay tuned for the next one.